coming tonight, especially in view of the weather. I hope you've got your slickers on and everything, but it will be nice when we go out tomorrow. I'm saying that now, hopefully. This is the lecture that is going to, for the Olmstead Society, kick off a weekend of events that celebrates Riverside's sesquicentennial. My name is Kathy Maloney. I'm the president of the Frederick Law Olmsted Society. Just a quick show of hands. How many are members in here of the Olmsted Society? Goodly number. Okay. For those who aren't, we really encourage you to join us just for a day or for a volunteer event or become a member. We're open to everybody. Our purpose is to celebrate humanity, nature, a sense of community, and the innovative and thoughtful essence of Olmsted's work. And throughout the year we have lectures like this, we have guided tours, we have fun events, we have landscape work days and more. As an example, tomorrow the Olmsted Society is hosting its House Walk, which we haven't had for 5 years, and Hopstop Craft Beer Festival. There's still tickets available for the House Walk. You can buy them cash or check at 300 Scottswood Road tomorrow. Come by around 11:30. The House Walk starts at noon, so we hope to see you there. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to thank a lot of people who put this together. There's been a lot of work on the part of Olmsted Society members and volunteers. First to Pastor Jackson and Linda Hutchison of the Riverside Presbyterian Church for allowing us to use their beautiful sanctuary. The church is on the site of the original non-denominational church in Riverside dating to 1869. And my understanding is it was called the Stone Chapel, and some of the stones were actually used in the original building. Thank you also to our lecture committee co-chairs, Dan Murphy, who's behind me, and Olivia Barraza, who's over here, who, as always, put these lectures together from initial concept to the final details. And now let me introduce our speakers for tonight. And many of you know them, but I want to give you just a little background. Blair Kamin has been the architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune since 1992. He is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism for his columns that included a series of articles on Chicago's lakefront. He's lectured widely and appeared on programs ranging from ABC's Nightline to WTTW Chicago 11 Chicago Tonight. Kamin has been a contributor or co-author of several books, and his collected columns have been published by the University of Chicago Press. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Kamin is a recipient of more than 30 awards, including 2 presented by the American Institute of Architects. He serves as an adjunct professor of art at North Central College and has served as a visiting critic at architecture schools including Harvard Graduate School of Design. Barbara Mahany spent nearly 3 decades as a reporter and a writer at the Chicago Tribune. She's now a freelance journalist and author of 2 collections of essays. Mahany began her professional life as a pediatric oncology nurse, but changed careers and attended Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, and I'll put it in here, Barbara, graduating at the top of her class. As a Tribune reporter, Mahany covered stories ranging from the Iran-Contra hearings, Prince Charles' visit to Chicago, cross-country ride with the truck driver of the year, I want to hear about that, Mother Teresa's nuns, I almost said guns, on Chicago's west side, Jello wrestlers, and fox hunters. I assume those are 2 separate stories. Her lifestyle stories on gardening, health, family, food, books, travel, and home have been published in the Los Angeles Times, the Baltimore Sun, and the Orlando Sentinel, among other papers. Blair and Barbara met and married while both were working at the Chicago Tribune, and we're very fortunate. This is the first time that they, as I understand it, that they have presented together. So I hope we give them a warm welcome so they take this show on the road. Please welcome Barbara and Blair.
Thanks, Kathy. Can you hear us okay? Okay. We're really excited to be here. We love Riverside, and we love Olmstead. And we're really appreciative that all of you came out tonight, despite the weather. Barbara, who has really a sharper eye than me, noticed that it was appropriate that there was a figure up there walking on water.
The figure is Jesus.
We'll be telling jokes tonight. A Jew and a Catholic walk into a Presbyterian church.
And God knows what unfolds.
Okay. It's really an honor for us to be participating in the 150th anniversary of Riverside, and we really want to thank Kathy and Dan behind us, the man behind the curtain who will be operating the slides.
And do you need the lights down so they can see the slides a little bit? Anyway, right. We will in fact forever be indebted to Kathy for handing us what I've come to think of as the Empty Nest Project. Whereas in the lonely weeks post drop-off of our youngest at college, we couldn't piddle away our days. No more listening for the wallowing in the sorrows of no more soccer car pools. No more listening for the unlocking of the front door at midnight or later. No more restocking the fridge on an hourly basis. We have 2 boys, and one boy had 1,000 friends who were always at our house. No, we had a job to do. We were going to trek to the storybook wonderful village of Riverside, and we were going to retrace the steps and the genius of Frederick Law Olmsted, uncover the roots of New England here in the flatland of the Middle West, along the banks of the great, snaking, rising Des Plaines River. I wasn't sure if I was going to get across tonight, but I did. Never before have Blair and I, as Kathy said, sat side by side typing, poring over images and blueprints and archival records. And here's a sweet little architectural secret. Admit it, at least one reason you came here tonight was to see if you could weed out any family secrets. So here's the secret. I grew enchanted all over again. You might say, fell in love again. Watching the way Blair's mind works, watching him delve into the volumes of knowledge he carries within him. I couldn't choke up. Watching him connect dot after dot to great blue line. Watching a lifetime of architectural passion pour onto the page, or in this case, the screen. So with no further ado, Blair Kamin.
Mahany, you really rendered me choked up, as my ancestors from the Stadel would say, verklempt. I will try to proceed after that heartfelt introduction. As you can see from our title slide, our aim tonight is to illuminate the New England roots of Chicago's seal and its motto, Herbs and Orto, City in a Garden. We also want to trace the historical connection of the New England Common to Riverside, a link suggested in the names of some of your most important streets and public spaces. Now, for starters, we should acknowledge that the term city in a garden is fraught. Our late, great Chicago Tribune colleague, Mike Royko, always argued that the real motto of Chicago should be ubi est mea, where's mine? But that would not serve the purposes of this lecture very well, so we will stick with Herbs and Orto. Now, as you can see, these words appear on the Chicago seal along with several symbols. An American shield that represents the national spirit of Chicago, a sheaf of wheat symbolizing activity and plenty, a Native American with a bow and arrow who represents the discoverer of the site of Chicago. There is also a ship in full sail that represents the supposedly peaceful approach of civilization and commerce. And lastly, there is a sleeping infant lying on its back on a seashell, which recalls the ancient symbol of a pearl and represents Chicago's identity as the gem of the Great Lakes. We find it significant that the phrase herbs in orto appears on the central axis of the seal. We also think it's important that those three Latin words are the only ones within the seal's inner circle. So the message the seal sends is clear. Cultivated nature, the garden, not wild nature, the prairie, is central to how Chicago views and represents itself. The city aspires to be a locus of commerce and industry, of business and busyness, and yet it also seeks to be the opposite of those things: leisure, culture, contemplation, and connections to nature. Fair enough, you might ask, but where did this conflicted dual identity come from? Why did the makers of the seal emphasize garden as well as city? Now, for answers to that question, we do not think it wise to look to a certain larger, noisier, more vulgar, and less architecturally distinguished city to which Chicago is often compared. You see the slide of Manhattan on the bottom. Instead, we train our gaze on Boston, which has long styled itself the Athens of America. This is the city, or more correctly, the region of Harvard and MIT, of sailboats on the Charles River, of town plans where, as Elizabeth Warren might observe, the greedy, profit-making forces of capitalism are counterbalanced by equally potent forces that stress the common good. Now, a prime contributor to that identity is Frederick Law Olmsted, who created the magnificent chain of Boston area open space called the Emerald Necklace. We have experienced its beauty firsthand in everything from the swan boats that ply the waters of the public garden to the sinuous trails that trace westward from downtown. In our view, there is a direct connection between Olmsted's vision of the public realm and Chicago's extraordinary chain of lakefront parks. Olmsted didn't simply design two of these parks, Washington and Jackson, as well as the midway that links them. In Chicago and here in Riverside, he and other New Englanders provided the intellectual and the aesthetic vision for what these public spaces could mean for a democratic society. And that is the connection we mean to explore tonight.
So how did we become so steeped in Chicago's New England and Olmstedian roots? We took a field trip, a family field trip, a one-year family field trip. We uprooted ourselves from our leafy burg along the lake, 60091, AKA Wilmette, shh, and rerouted ourselves in the People's Republic of Cambridge from zip code 60091 to 02138. Cambridge, Mass., a town that proudly proclaims itself, this is on signs in the windows of the coffee shops, the world's most opinionated zip code. And it's probably true, especially now, at this moment in history. It was all launched on the shoulders of one brave, unblinking fifth grader, the one you see here. On the left as a 7-year-old, and on the right as a rising college freshman. Oh, if only we could take a picture of him tonight on the campus of Kenyon College. We would see what he's doing. And here's how it happened. 7 years ago, Blair got an out-of-the-blue email asking if he'd ever thought of applying for a Neiman Journalism Fellowship at Harvard. He instinctively brushed it aside. No, we have a fifth grader. We couldn't pull him out of soccer. We couldn't take him out of school, blah, blah, blah. And I said, wait, always the wait one. Wait, I protested. Let's ask Ted. That's his name. And so we did. That night at dinner at our old maple dinner table. Next slide. There's the maple dinner table. It's the dinner table I grew up with as a kid, so that table is about 300 years old. Anyway, intrepid Teddy didn't skip a beat. I want to see the world, he insisted. No matter how we came at it, trying to explain to him he wouldn't be on the same soccer team. His soccer team wasn't going to travel to Boston for the year. His classmates weren't going to travel to Boston for the year. He kept saying, I want to see the world. And so, fast forward 6 months, he found himself in Cambridge, of course, in the lotus position in a park down the block from the Cambridge apartment. And Blair, next slide. And Blair found himself loping up the sidewalk to the magnificent, wonderful Lipman House to be met by 23 other journalists from around the country and the world and the academic treasure that is Harvard's curriculum and faculty. A highlight of the year for every fellow is a tradition called the sounding, where you explain to your colleagues why I do what I do. Blair, originally a New Jerseyan, who's now deeply entrenched in the world of Chicago, decided to bring Chicago to Cambridge via a taste of his favorite restaurant, Mahany's Deli. Side note, Blair really got into the culinary aspect of his sounding, which is like a 2-hour presentation, but he was just worrying about the food. So he and Kenny Raskin, who owns Mahany's, had many emails and many phone calls, and we had to rein Blair in when he was starting to think about flying in hundreds and hundreds of pounds of corned beef and pastrami from Chicago. But there's ancestral roots to that. You don't mind if I go off script for a minute. Shortly after we got married, Blair's adorable, she became my little Jewish grandmother from West Palm Beach, Florida, decided she needed to teach me, her little Catholic new daughter-in-law, how to make all the essentials of Jewish life, beginning with the brisket. So Syl decided that she should fly up to Chicago with a raw slab of beast in her suitcase. So it's not that unusual that Blair would think to just fly hundreds of pounds of corned beef and pastrami.
Meat matters.
Meat matters. Meat matters. Anyway, so we convinced him to settle for a shipment. They're still hanging out in our pantry because he got so many of those Mahany's giant signature paper cups and napkins and a coterie of diner salt, pepper, and sugar shakers. Also conveniently, the Nieman Fellowship positioned us a mere 2 hours away from our firstborn, who that year was a sophomore at Amherst College and who wasn't quite sure what to make of the fact that it sure looked like his mom, dad, and little brother were chasing him across the country. Mom, why are you guys planning on shadowing me around the country for the rest of my life? Adult life? No, not at all. One of the great moments was the weekend the famed head of the Charles Regatta was the weekend of the famed head of the Charles Regatta, when crew teams from around the globe descend on Cambridge and race the many miles of the Charles River. And when the entire Amherst 4, that's the boat of 4 rowers, descended on our shoebox of an apartment for a pre-regatta lunch, dinner, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and whatever sleep they could squeeze in onto the couches. It was a great year for our family, the best year. Imagine finding yourself in a college classroom, a Harvard college classroom, at the ripe, unfettered age of 55. As the Nieman affiliate, we adopted the much more luxurious-sounding name of Covivant? The Covivant. That's what we called the tag-alongs. I was a tag-along. As the Nieman affiliate, I got to take classes willy-nilly with no strings attached. No exams, no grades, Henry Louis Gates, Helen Vendler, the great poetry critic. It was amazing. Although I did have to pay up by giving my own mini-sounding to the Nieman Fellows, but I didn't get to bring in Mahany's or my favorite restaurants, so too bad. We made the most of our Bay State explorations, trekking to Amherst for more rowing, and getting to intimately research every single soccer field in the Boston metro area. And Blair, it turned out, became fixated on gates after walking through Harvard's gates.
Wait, did you say fixated?
I did say fixated. I did. The proper term would be obsessed. Obsessed.
Obsessed. You are brutal.
It's true, though. But true, clinically true.
But as always, correct.
Thank you.
So it is true. I did become obsessed with gates, like Harvard's main gate, the Johnston Gate, which was donated to Fair Harvard by a Chicago real estate mogul named Samuel Johnston, who happened to be a Harvard alum. It's a gorgeous gate designed by McKim, and White, and it blends superbly, as you can see from the slide, with, well, you can't really see from the slide, but it does blend superbly with Harvard's colonial era buildings and provides a gateway directly into University Hall, the white building you see in the background. This gate is full of wonderful details, including Samuel Johnston's personal seal. You see it on the left. It's complete with a Latin inscription indicating his home city, which in Latin is Chicagoniensis. Here and in other gates around Harvard Yard, brick, stone, and wrought iron are memorably fused into symbols of belonging, symbols of the university, at least for those who passed muster with the Harvard admissions office. I do love these gates. You're seeing an axonometric or bird's eye view of them here. But I would admit that they are the very opposite of an Olmstead landscape. The gates join with fencing to form an enclosure that separates the contemplative greensward of Harvard Yard from the chaotic city around it. And the key word there is enclosure. When land is enclosed, control is exerted. Some belong inside the enclosure, and others are relegated to the area outside the perimeter. An Olmstead landscape, of course, is very different. It's open, it's inviting, it doesn't restrict, it's democracy defined. But I do still love the Harvard gates, and I admit I was obsessed with them. My obsession led me to conduct walking tours of the gates and to write a book, Gates of Harvard Yard, and to a mandate that all future family trips include destinations with gates fit for Instagram-ready snapshots. Now, during this gate-obsessed Neiman year, we also had the good fortune to visit Frederick Law Olmsted's home in the Boston suburb of Brookline. We reveled in every nook and cranny that we saw there, including custom-made drawers that housed Olmsted's colored pencils, the ones he used to fashion his alluring renderings. And we took equal delight in coming to a deeper understanding of Olmsted's creativity. There we go. And its results, particularly the emerald necklace. In Boston, Olmsted designed and supervised the construction of a regional park system, a feat he was unable to accomplish in New York. And the outcome in the emerald necklace is truly extraordinary. It's a linear pastoral network of trails, bridges, waterways, and mature trees. The emerald necklace is a jewel in Boston's crown. It gives the city good reason to call itself a civilized metropolis. And for our purposes, it is a seed whose spirit gets transplanted to Chicago and to Riverside.
To follow that further, as journalists, we're taught to watch what people do as well as what they say. We look at campaign contributions in addition to design manifestos, and so it is here. We believe, as Woodward and Bernstein did during their Watergate investigation, in following the money. Not because there's some scandal to uncover, but because money goes hand in hand with power, and power goes hand in hand with the ability to shape a city. For example, One way to get at the delightful mashup of Byzantine and Gothic architecture at Venice's Doge's Palace is to look at trade routes of the Venetian Empire. They went north to Europe, where Gothic reigned supreme, as well as east to the Byzantine Empire, with its rich tradition of mosaics and spectacular surface treatments. Reflecting the influence of those trade routes, the Doge's Palace features pointed Gothic arches and a facade whose patterned two-dimensionality has drawn comparisons to a carpet. The same method tells us a lot about Chicago. Take, for example, the famous Monadnock building by architects Burnham and Root and developers Peter and Shepard Brooks. The Brooks brothers, not to be confused with the Haberdashers, hailed from Medford, Massachusetts, and they happened to like Native American names. One of those names was Monadnock, familiar to New Englanders as the majestic mountain in southern New Hampshire. Monadnock means mountain that stands alone. The 16-story building isn't just named after a mountain. It belongs to the Chicago tradition of building our mountains, a way to compensate for the pancake flat landscape. We see that tradition in the topography of the Willis and Aqua Towers. Aqua, by Jeannie Gang, drew inspiration from the stone outcroppings that flank rivers and lakes throughout the Midwest. The Brooks brothers, pictured in the upper left, on cue, the thunder rains down. The Brooks brothers also gave us, maybe they're telling us something. Maybe they didn't like that I didn't. Anyway, the Brooks brothers also gave us the Marquette building.
That was actually Frank Lloyd Wright. He's
yeah.
upset.
Oh, yeah.
He's upset that he's not in the lecture.
We have a whole coterie of architecture jokes in our family. Even the little kindergartner used to know architecture stories. Anyway, the Brooks brothers also gave us the Marquette building, whose expression of its underlying steel frame makes it a prime example of the first Chicago School of Architecture. And they developed the magnificent Rookery building, whose lacy light court stands in dramatic contrast to its muscular brownstone exterior. New England's influence is equally apparent in the Pittsfield building, a 1927 Gothic Revival skyscraper by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. The tower was commissioned by the trustees of the Marshall Field Estate and named for the town in western Massachusetts where the young entrepreneur got his first job. You see a slide of downtown Pittsfield in the upper right. Another notable loop skyscraper, the Conway building of 1913 by D.H. Burnham and Company, recognizes Marshall Field's birthplace, the town of Conway, Massachusetts, seen in the postcard up on the left. It too was built by the Marshall Field Estate. The Conway building cements a Chicago-New England connection that is evident in the town of Conway's own Field Memorial Library, which wouldn't be out of place amid the mausoleums of Graceland Cemetery, where Field is buried. New England-born real estate investors weren't the only ones who shaped Chicago. New England architects had an enormous influence, none more so than Henry Hobson Richardson. The severe style of his John J. Glessner house on Prairie Avenue clearly affected Louis Sullivan and Dagmar Adler as they designed the auditorium building, a link evident in Adler and Sullivan's austere exterior with its Romanesque arcades and lack of fussy Victorian ornament. There's Frank again.
Yeah. So the point we're trying to make here is that there's a lot of Yankee austerity in Chicago's commercial architecture. Yet it's also important to point out that there's also a lot of Boston and New England in Chicago's civic realm, the proud collection of museums, public buildings, and parks that really distinguish Chicago as a city. The city of Broad Shoulders, for example, turned to the Athens of America to design its public library, following the classical template of McKinby and White's revered Boston Public Library. The Boston architects Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge shaped what is now the Chicago Cultural Center. And again, following Boston's precedent, they made their library a people's palace with spectacular interior spaces like Preston Bradley Hall, which you see on the lower right, and its spectacular Tiffany Dome. The same firm, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, also designed the Art Institute of Chicago's iconic building along Michigan Avenue. And that building took further cues from Boston right down to its pedimented temple front, which imitated the Boston Art Museum. Now, an equally profound influence on Chicago's civic realm can be found in New England Town Commons. And I'm illustrating that here with the impact, or I'm illustrating that impact, I should say, with the town common of Amherst, Massachusetts, a charming college town where I went to college, set amid the rolling hills of western Massachusetts. Here you see the common's fall foliage unfurling from the ochre-colored octagon building in the lower left and spreading northward to the towers of the University of Massachusetts, which you see in the upper right. Guess who produced a design for this common? Frederick Law Olmsted. Working for Austin Dickinson, brother of the poet Emily, and a mover and shaker who wanted to beautify the town, Olmsted crafted his plan in 1874, and you see it here. If you look at the top, you'll see that it features curving park drives and rows of trees that flank the streets and frame a central open space. Now, little of Olmsted's plan was actually realized, but as I discovered in writing an architectural guide to Amherst College that will be published next year, the roots of New England Town Commons can be found, not surprisingly, in England and the land use customs of the Puritans who established their New England in the early 17th century. And here you see examples of that. The Puritans hailed from English freeholder villages whose residents had a long and hard-won custom of sharing land and sometimes owning local land resources in common. Forests and woodlands provided building materials and game. Rivers and ponds yielded fish, and livestock grazed on the shared land. Such practices set the freeholder villages apart from the typical English villages where members of the local aristocracy owned and controlled the use of almost all the land. Now, the Puritans extended that tradition to New England, and their descendants gave it a distinctively democratic underpinning. It was on town commons, after all, that militias were marshaled to fight the Redcoats in the Battle of Lexington. Cows grazed on commons, as they still do in England's Cambridge University, and farmers grew hay on them. I think it's interesting to point out here that these utilitarian uses made commons different from parks. Parks arose in the 19th century as public pleasure grounds that provided relief from crowded and filthy industrial cities. The town commons, in contrast, were rustic rather than refined. Amherst even had a frog pond inhabited with big, bellowing bullfrogs. But the impulse behind the common and the park remained essentially the same. Collective space counterbalanced atomistic capitalism. Shared land suggested shared concerns, and common space was meant to inspire a common destiny. So, it was only natural in 1836 that the tradition of these New England town commons would come into play when 3 men were named by the state of Illinois to supervise construction of a canal that would join Chicago to the Illinois River. The 3 included Vermont native Gordon Hubbard and they decided not to sell a narrow strip of lakefront land along Lake Michigan between Madison Street and 12th Street. Instead, as the great Lois Willy related in her classic book, these commissioners wrote on the lakefront edge of their map, "Public ground, a common, to remain forever open, clear, and free of any buildings or other obstruction whatever." It is appropriate that thunder is rolling as those immortal words are sounded. Now, 60 years later, lawyers working for Aaron Montgomery Ward, who you see on the lower right, would invoke those words in courtrooms to beat back Daniel Burnham's plan to locate the Field Museum of Natural History in the middle of Grant Park. Similarly, in the 1970s, after Lake Point Tower and what is now the McCormick Place Lakeside Center usurped prime lakefront land in the city of Chicago, the city passed the Lake Michigan and Chicago Lakefront Protection Ordinance, which outlawed the construction of any more buildings that would seize land meant for all. And since then, the words "forever open, clear, and free" have become a rallying cry for opponents of schemes like George Lucas's planned Museum of Narrative Arts, or as I like to call it, the Jabba the Hutt Museum on the lakefront. What everyone forgets, though, is that the words that preceded "forever open, clear, and free" were "public ground, a common." Without their democratic lineage and their impact on the landscape, Chicago would be a very different place. And so too would Riverside. Here in Riverside, as in Chicago, there was Eastern money behind real estate development. It came from the developer Emery Childs. And there were also high aspirations. As Charles Beveridge and Paul Rochelot have written, Olmsted and his partner, Calvert Vaux, sought to simultaneously provide urban services and preserve rural elements. So Riverside was conceived then, as these images suggest, as a railroad suburb that would be part of a metropolitan area, even as its curving streets, soothing vistas, and absence of right-angled intersections would make it stand apart from that very enabler of real estate transactions, the relentlessly repetitive street grid of Chicago.
To Olmstead, the layout of the streets was not utilitarian, but fundamental to his goal of establishing a soothing sense of place. As he said in this quote here, "We should recommend the general adoption in the design of your roads of gracefully curved lines, generous spaces, and the absence of sharp corners. The idea being to suggest and imply leisure, contemplativeness, and happy tranquility."
Our visits here have suggested how well Olmsted succeeded. The town center quickly establishes, when you arrive, the town center quickly establishes the artful balance between the city and the garden. First, you see the Riverside train station, and then you immediately encounter a sign of civilization, the Victorian Gothic Waterworks Tower. But what you also see straight away is a public realm that seizes upon natural beauty, specifically the bend in the Des Plaines River, and advertises the name Riverside to great effect. And this, as I found out on a secret slide-taking mission here last Saturday, is not false advertising. This is really the weather from last Saturday. As you may remember, it was kind of cloudy, not sunny. I didn't rip off these slides from the web. I took them with my own smartphone. The river introduces the pleasing sight of the water, and the lushly planted land along its banks frames picturesque vistas of the town. And Wait a minute here.
18.
Oh, here we go. And that was scary. This landscape land also contains pathways which make it seem that you are miles from the urban hubbub of Chicago. You can stroll here, you can fish here. It's beautiful, it's democratic, it's soothing.
And it is, we must sadly admit, don't tell the mayor, better than Wilmette. It is. It is. I meant don't tell Wilmette's mayor. Go ahead and tell Riverside's mayor, but not Wilmette's.
You're always a crowd pleaser.
Yeah. Be quiet.
Okay. What's equally artful about Olmsted's plan is the way it threads the tradition of the common throughout the suburban fabric. As you all know, the park along the river isn't the only lush green space. These wonderful small triangular greens are threaded, situated throughout your town. It's all very different from a New England town green like the one in New Haven, Connecticut. That green is lovely and dignified with its 3 churches, but it stands alone at the center of the city's 9 squares. In Riverside, by contrast, again, more slides from last Saturday, the small greens occur frequently, and they allow for pleasing vistas toward the houses that line them, as well as fine views from the houses toward the greens and the activity occurring on them.
So as Olmstead said, space along Riverside's roads should express the fact that its residents, quote, enjoy much in common, and all the more enjoy it because it is common. This feature demonstrated, quote, the completeness and choiceness and beauty of the means they possess of coming together. You can tell us later if that works.
Olmsted even took the idea of the common and elongated it to create this delightfully linear series of greens, the aptly named Long Common. Like the public space along the river, Long Common Road is a form of advertising, for it provides a graceful entry to visitors coming from Chicago. In the Long Common and the adjoining Scotswood Common, the language and lineage of the New England town common are really made clear. Yet, even though Olmsted was turning to the landscape traditions of the past, he did not copy them. Instead, he adapted them to the present, his present, the industrial age, the railroad suburb, the sprawling metropolitan region. None of those existed in colonial America when the first New England town commons were built. Here in Riverside, Olmsted remade the simple notion of the common, of the square or rectangular open space plugged into the center of the New England town, and he transformed it into a dynamic sequence of spaces, something you experience through time as new vistas unfold and frazzled spirits are soothed. We find Olmsted's approach to be especially relevant today, when the nation is more politically and spatially polarized than ever before. Perhaps Olmsted would have objected to the visual spectacle of Millennium Park's Bean and the Pritzker Pavilion, for these tightly bunched, large-scale features urbanize lakefront parkland, extending the city into the park rather than providing relief from the crowded loop. But we do think that Olmsted would have approved of the way Millennium Park has become Chicago's town square, a place that draws together people from different races and classes, and even from different countries.
Common spaces underscore our common destiny, our common humanity. We see that in Boston Common. We see that along the Chicago lakefront and in Riverside. As we've tried to show tonight, the influential words public land are common to remain forever open, clear, and free are a gift to Chicago from New England, a legacy that continues to shape our landscape and our worldview.
Now, as always, Barbara gets the last word. But I get the last slide. Herbs in Horto? Not here in Riverside, the suburb in a garden. We leave you with this suggestion for a new village seal, Riverside Suburbs in Horto. Thank you for inviting, we're not graphic artists, so.
I'm not. Yeah, Judy Anderson, sorry.
Thank you very much for inviting us and filling our empty nest with newfound purpose. We really appreciate that you came out tonight, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Right here, Kathy.
So I'm going to do the Phil Donahue thing, and this is so that you can be heard. This is all on, Joe? Okay. How about some questions? Over here. Sorry. Here is the question. I'm going to pass this down then.
How much, I mean, at one point I had heard the rumor that Olmstead was following the contours of the land. And I have two daughters who live in Riverside now. And any time it rains much, I jokingly call my daughter's backyard Lake Repton. It has a weeping willow in that section. I would guess that Olmstead covered a creek. Am I right?
Olmstead covered a creek?
Olmstead covered a creek?
Creek was basically having natural drainage of a creek.
Okay.
Just was obliterated.
Okay. Well, I knew Frank Lloyd Wright would come into this somehow, and, you know.
He insisted on it.
There's always the story of the irresponsible architect or landscape architect, you know, and this dealing with this messy little thing called water. Kathy is really probably better. We are not experts in Olmstead, and Kathy is. And Kathy, can you answer that question? Because I can't, and I don't think Barbara can.
He knows I can't.
I can give it a shot. He did try to follow the contours of the land, but there was a lot of cut and fill, as any contracting situation may happen. The commons themselves were raised initially, but to build the roads and whatnot, a lot of changes had to occur. And, you know, in terms of did he build on a creek, I have looked at some different hydrology studies, in particular underneath my house, and I have seen that the water table is pretty high. So I don't know that, I mean, a lot of different land areas are wetlands. For example, now you see Swan Pond gets a lot more water, mostly because there's a lot more rain events that are happening more frequently. So did he build on top of a creek? I think every individual site is a little different, and there are hydrology maps that you can look at. But generally, he tried to follow the contours of the land as they were given, mostly not only from an aesthetic point of view, to have those curves and whatnot, but from a practical standpoint. You know, if you've got something that's raised and it fits with your artistic vision, let's keep it raised. That's as far as I can read and understand so far.
Thanks for bailing us out, Kathy.
I'm
Literally.
Some other questions?
Do we know if he saw the
development of Riverside, and so, yeah, that's what I had in mind, or did he go off to the next project and not come back, Olmstead? I know it took a while to kind of come to fruition and such, but did he see it, his plan materialize?
My understanding is that the plan for Riverside was not fully realized. There was a panic in 1871, I believe. And
Maybe in the fire.
what's that?
The fire was 71, and then 73 was the panic right on top of it.
Thank you. That's right. So those things combine to subvert and, well, to make it more difficult for Emery Childs to fully realize his plan. As I've read, there were refugees from the fire who camped out in Riverside, right? And so for a while, it took a while to get some steam up. But I think the key thing is that the essence of Olmsted's plan was realized. And whenever anyone writes about Olmsted, whenever there are monographs about Olmsted, Riverside is mentioned. It's mentioned as, glowingly as this, beautifully planned suburb, illustrating his ability and desire to extend his vision from cities, Central Park, et cetera, to an entire metropolitan area. So, I mean, it wasn't all realized, but enough of it was that it continues to reverberate today as an example of really skillful and visionary suburban planning.
Thank you both for coming to Riverside to talk with us. It's really great. I have a question about what do you think, I haven't kept up, Blair, with your latest on this whole topic, but what would Olmsted say, and what would you say, about the Obama Library and
Did you know that?
the two takes on that, if you would enlighten us. And I'm not up to date in terms of the latest about that whole project and where it stands.
Yeah, sort of like what would Jesus say? What would Olmsted say? It's appropriate that gets asked in a church. It's funny when I was telling my colleague John Cass, who is from Western Springs and whose desk is next to mine, about this talk. The first thing he mentioned when I raised the issue of the Kamin, forever open, clear, and free, was, what about that tower that's going to glorify that liberal democratic politician from the south side of Chicago?
As only Cass would say.
As only Cass would say. We really like Cass, even though we don't necessarily agree with his politics. It's a tough issue. And what would Olmsted say? There are two views. I mean, there's the sort of hardcore preservationist view, which is that the Obama Library compromises historic features of Jackson Park. And that was presented recently in a report that was commissioned as part of the federal review of the planned Obama Presidential Center. The other view, which I've articulated, is that Olmsted was a pragmatist, and he believed that landscapes should evolve along with the cultures that they were meant to serve. And I think Riverside, with its reliance on the railroad suburb, et cetera, is an example of that philosophy. So I would argue that, in other words, it's not Obama versus Olmsted, but rather the park will evolve, Jackson Park will evolve in ways that will improve upon some of the damage that was wrought to Olmsted's vision, particularly in the 1960s when massive roads were cut through that park and other things. I am still concerned about the tower, the museum tower. It's more than 200 feet tall, which is about 50 feet taller than the Science and Industry Museum. But the architects, Todd Williams and Billy Chen, are very good. And, you know, I mean, as much, so, and, I mean, it's kind of like, I have an expectation that they'll do something very good, very responsible, but until I see it, until it's finished, you know, I'm nervous. So it's a very tough issue, and I think, you know, you'll get Olmstedians on both sides of it.
In order to keep the ambience of Riverside and the Olmstead plan, are there ordinance to preserve not only the intent, but the original design? Because now, if you can build it taller, you can build it more densely, you start losing the whole ambience of what Olmsted was trying to establish. So what protections does Riverside have that I think Chicago's forgotten about and just about every other suburb to make this really, truly an Olmsted dream?
We're not familiar with the nitty-gritty of Riverside's ordinances. I think we do know that Olmsted mandated certain lot sizes, correct, Kathy? Yes. Certain widths. And those contributed greatly to the character of the town, as you're suggesting. I think it's significant, too, that his vision was fleshed out, as it were, by Victorian cottages and picturesque homes that were asymmetrical, that were based in part on the philosophy of Andrew Jackson Downing, the landscape architect who articulated the whole idea of the country home, a respite from the city, the realm of the domestic partner in the household, the wife. That's the ideal vision, and if that's being chipped away at, obviously it's regrettable. But I mean, I can't speak with any authority about the everyday, the latest nitty-gritty of the ordinances and how that's what protections are still evident, to preserve the town.
I can jump in real quick. I mean, Blair's got a much broader view, and I'm wallowing down a little bit in the details, but in the 1970s, when Riverside was declared a National Historic Landmark, with that comes a number of obligations, and there were commissions set up that are still very active today, the Preservation Commission and the Landscape Advisory Commission, among them planning and zoning and so forth. So there are ordinances as it pertains to building heights, use of buildings, size of lots, whether you can subdivide or not, different kinds of landscaping issues and so forth. And in fact, the Olmsted Society, one of its missions is to be an advocacy group if there are issues that come to the fray where, maybe there's some research needed about what was the original intent. So as far as I know, yes, there are ordinances. Are they perfect? Do we come across issues a lot? Yep. Mm-hmm. But they are in place, particularly since the landmark status came about.
I think the thing is that, in any plan, there will be goofballs who deviate, from the prevailing heights and character. That's almost inevitable. The key is the framework of the roads, the open spaces, the triangular, smaller open spaces, the engagement, this balance between city and garden. And as long as those things are there, Riverside will be Riverside. It will be more Riverside if more beautiful homes are built, as Kathy is suggesting. But I mean, the core of the vision is, interestingly enough, in the voids, not the solids, right? The voids, the open spaces between And yet, they are, they're the core of, what this community is and why it's truly extraordinary. When I came here last Saturday, I was really just blown away. You live in an extraordinary landscape. When we go outside of our house, we look straight down a street. It's a nice street, and there are a lot of trees. It's called Maple Avenue. But we look at this very kind of oblique angle at, the other houses, whereas you have these wonderful, picturesque vistas that are opened up for you. And I hope you never take those for granted, because they're a gift from, one of the greatest landscape architects ever to walk the face of the earth. So those things really make Riverside special, and really extraordinary in the history of town planning and suburbs throughout the world.
Can I take a few more over on this side? Let's go over here.
Riverside doesn't have alleys. Is that something? Some do, but a lot of us don't. Is that something that came from New England?
Wow. That's a really good question.
Probably.
Yeah, alleys are very Chicago.
Yeah, there were no alleys in Cambridge. There are not alleys in New York. Okay, here's a New England expert. He says no alleys in New England, so that's the answer.
And if you've ever been to Manhattan, you know that the
Garbage
trash,
cans on the
garbage cans right in the street. It smells. There are rats. But I think that alleys are very
Chicago.
much very much associated with the Chicago grid. So when the trash comes, when the garbage trucks come here, it's in the front. Yeah.
There's no trash in Riverside. Right? We drank the Kool-Aid. Oh, that would have been nice. One more question or two more? I don't care.
Got one here, and then we'll take one more.
Okay, sure.
I've got a comment and a question. The comment is, I believe there's photos of the Babson estate with a creek running through it. Here's my question. The original plan of Riverside shows a huge portion west of First Avenue. Why was that never built up?
Good thing Kathy's here.
I believe they were not able to buy that parcel of land at the time. Most of the land that they bought was from David Gage, about 1,600 acres, and a little piece of it they bought on the west side. I believe, I'm not even going to guess at his name, but the rest of it was not for sale quite as yet, so that's why it wasn't built up, except for that little bit in Brookfield. Well, it's not Brookfield, it's Riverside on the other side. Any questions over here?
Thank you. So, thanks, guys. So, as you alluded to, Riverside is built with the kind of curvilinear street layout. So, I was kind of wondering, while your time in Cambridge, did you experience towns with that curvilinear kind of plot layout? And then, what's your views on the curvilinear streets versus the grid concept?
Well, the grid, certainly it's much easier to get lost in Boston than it is in Chicago, because they don't have a grid. But their streets are cow paths.
Yeah,
they're just
crazy.
There's no rhyme or reason. We would drive to soccer matches, and we didn't have a smartphone, and we would get lost all the time. It was terrible. Olmstead, you guys tell me, do you get lost here when you drive around? You do? Okay, interesting. That's interesting, really. Even after you've lived here for a lot of years? Oh, well, I guess I was way too nice in praising, and you got to ram some straight streets right through the center of the town. Wow. That's interesting.
Well, Chicago had the luxury of the geometric grid because of the fire, and there were no cow paths to follow after the fire.
No, that's true. I mean, it's like all things. There's trade-offs, and so the picturesque aspects of Riverside's curving streets, which I guess clearly from the reaction of all of you are not necessarily make the city less legible, less easy to navigate, have a negative impact. But you could also argue that the same thing could be said of many European cities, which have, kind of twisting medieval streets, and people go there and they find those charming. Like I was just in, but it helps to have signs, I guess. Like I was just in Venice, and there's a sign that says, this is how you get to the Piazza San Marco, but you still get lost, right? Sorry? Oh, okay.
Maybe they're together. Did you have that gelato? No.
Yeah, gelato was great. Anyway, so yeah, there's a trade-off. I mean, and it's really interesting to hear your reaction. I'm really curious now. Are there other things? I don't mean to make this into a dump on Olmstead session, but I'm really curious. Like, are there other faults you find with his plan? You live with it all the time, so. Fill us in. Yes. Oh, there's a hand shot up right in the back. What's that? Really? So.
Aww.
Okay. So drainage. Right. Okay, so more complaints about drainage. Now that I just want everyone to know that those words come from one of your residents, David Kidwell, who sat across the aisle from me at the Chicago Tribune, and I would hear David screaming at city officials as he researched the red light camera story that unmasked Rahm Emanuel's plan to fleece the taxpayers of Chicago for every last cent. And David would hear me screaming at Frank Gehry and other famous architects, and it was just really entertaining, right, David? So, and the follow the money slides that were in our lecture tonight were for David because he's an investigative reporter, and he promised me that would come here. So as a kind of, offering to David, we had Hal Holbrook. And David informs me that...
Yeah, as every good editor fact-checked us and told us.
Yeah, that Deep Throat never really said follow the money, that was only in the movie, right? Oh, wow. See, you learn something new every day.
Investigative reporting secrets.
That's right. Anyway, thank you, David, and thank you all very much. We really enjoyed talking to you.
This is a gift from the Higgins Glass Company. They're our very own.
It's gorgeous.
So,
I thought you were putting it on the altar. Oh, that's beautiful.
Thanks.
Thank you.